Lovely. So do you want to give me a big thumbs up if you can see this? Thank you. Okay, so we're talking today about trauma-informed or creating trauma-informed communities and sharing some creativity, some creative processes and ideas of how you can kind of tackle this quite difficult topic. So the first thing that I want to say is that as we're talking about this subject and thinking about this subject, it might be, people might find it quite difficult because they might see themselves reflected or people that they're close to reflected. And I'd encourage people to use the support systems around you. So if you know that some of this might be quite hard for you, I definitely encourage you to stay and be part of the session. But if you're finding it difficult, just pay extra attention to what support systems you've got around you while we talk about this topic. And I'm going to start with a story about why I'm interested in this topic as myself, but also with the organisation that I work for. So a long time ago, I got a job in the NHS, and previously I'd worked in charities, and in those charities, we'd often tried to work with health. And this was before social prescribing and before like collaborations between health and the voluntary sector. And I'd got this job in the NHS, and I thought it was, my big break. It was when I was going to actually be able to make a difference. And on that first week, we had there was a refurbishment going on of the office, and my boss was away. So because of that, I was given a sort of timetable of induction activities. And those induction activities included going and having these meetings with these really important people that I was a bit scared of. And it also included a series of lectures. And one of those lectures was about trauma and ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And up on this big screen, if you imagine this big lecture hall with a huge screen, I'm sitting there with loads of people I don't know. I'm already quite nervous because it's the first day of the job or first week of the job. And these slides start coming up all about how if you've experienced trauma or adverse childhood experiences, these are all the health implications. These are all the social implications, and these are all the emotional implications. And it painted this really quite scary picture of if you've experienced any of these different types of trauma, then this is how your life is going to look. And as someone who had quite a high number of these adverse childhood experiences, I looked at that screen and I felt, pretty terrified and pretty upset. And I left, and I didn't have my boss there. I didn't have a space to go. I didn't have a team. And I sat in a hospital corridor and just had sort of 10 minutes to gather myself before I went off to meet with one of these important people. And that's why I think trauma-informed practice, so it's not just how we work with our clients, but it's how we work within our whole organization, is so important. So trauma-informed practice includes our systems and processes. It includes our team and how we work. It includes the way we work with clients and the way we interact with partners. And taking a trauma-informed approach to all of that work can help keep people safe and supported, including our teams and the people we work with. And some of you might recognize your own story in that little experience. So I'm going to share some slides, a little bit about trauma now. First of all, I should tell you who I am. So I run a community interest company with my mum and my sisters, and we offer coaching and organisational development support for charities and public sector teams. And the organisations we like to work with are organisations that are somehow dismantling inequality. And the two things that we offer are strategy design and culture making. And we do that through our coaching and away days and board development days and online sessions like this. It's just a little bit about who we are. So trauma, what does trauma mean? So trauma is the lasting emotional response that results through living through a distressing event. So it's perfectly possible to be part of a distressing event and not be traumatized. So trauma in this context is when things stick with you, things impact your future life because of what you've been through. And experiencing a traumatic event can harm someone's sense of safety, their sense of self, their ability to regulate their emotions, and their ability to navigate relationships. And some of you might notice how your work is responding to some of those issues, helping people feel safe, helping people feel a sense of themselves, support around people's emotions and relationships. And just to unpick the word adverse, so adverse childhood experiences relates to these things. So maltreatment, maybe abuse, maybe neglect, violence and coercion, adjustment, so asylum seeking, people coming to the country for the first time, or also ending relationships or life stages, prejudice, household or family adversity, inhumane treatment, adult responsibilities when we're too young, and bereavement and survivorship. So these are some of the things that can cause somebody to feel a sense of trauma. And there's all sorts of things that responses that people might have to that. And if you think back to that picture that I just painted of that lecture hall and all of these awful responses, I've actually got a different opinion, because I think people who've experienced trauma have got wisdom and resilience, and they're able to adapt and cope with difficult things happening around them. And I actually think some of those strengths we should be bringing into the work we do in the voluntary sector, rather than hiding away our experiences. So yeah, there's these kind of different ways of thinking around how trauma affects people. But there's some really interesting work around post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is the period that happens after you've experienced trauma and been supported to process that trauma. So things like personal strength, closer relationships, greater appreciation for life, new possibilities, spiritual development. And if you don't recognize your work within that kind of trauma response world, you may well recognize your work in these kind of domains. So your work might be contributing to individuals to rely on themselves, to handle challenges. Your work might be about developing closer relationships and supporting families or supporting communities, or appreciating life. Your work might be based on joy and helping people celebrate their experience in life. Or new possibilities. Your work might be about training and development and finding stuff out and growing your own experience. And it might be about spiritual development. So that deeper level, that deeper awareness and connection to something bigger than ourselves. So hopefully by now you've got a sense of why trauma-informed practice is important, and how your work might contribute to a trauma-informed place, a trauma-informed society. And we're going to go into a couple of activities in a minute, just talk you through some creative activities to bring more of this awareness into your organisations. So just to tell you a little bit about some of our trauma-informed projects. So I'm sat in Bolton Lads and Girls Club at the moment, and we are doing a project called Trauma-Informed Communities, where we're co-designing a toolkit of resources, templates, support and guidance to help the voluntary sector become trauma-informed. And we're looking at all sorts of different resources, from kind of compassionate leadership to training, to creating safe spaces, creating a landscape of support around people. And we're doing this by holding some co-design sessions, but also going out into communities and into organisations in Bolton to work out what matters to them. And that project will be completing the toolkit in January. So this is funded through Public Health in Bolton. We also have a project called Trauma Shift, which is about supporting voluntary sector organisations to recognise and support the wisdom, the resilience, the skills and strengths that they have within their organisations because their organizations are most likely including people who've experienced trauma. So I've got a bit of a belief around, I think a lot of people are drawn to the voluntary sector because they have themselves experienced hardship or adversity. But I also think that the awareness around that is often not within the workplace. So Trauma Shift includes this little badge that you can see, which you can download from our website, but it also includes free talks and workshops like this one, so that we can try and spread a bit of awareness of trauma-informed practice and really champion that idea that actually people who've experienced trauma bring wisdom and resilience, they're not broken. And the other thing is reflective practice circles. So we always build in reflective practice circles into our project plans. And this is where the staff and the delivery teams come together to reflect on the emotional impact of the work that they're doing, and provides a safe and supported space to kind of unpack some of that, our emotions around the work. Because often in the voluntary sector, we're almost taught to be unemotional or to not respond to things. And actually, the emotional impact of the work that we do can cause secondary trauma. So if we're serious about trauma-informed practice, that has to extend to our team, our volunteers, the people we work with, as much as the clients that we have. So when we talk about trauma-informed work, it's useful to think of it as part of a journey. So we start off on this journey, or we might not start at this point, but a starter point is a trauma-affected organisation. And as I'm going through these, you might like to kind of think about where you are in this journey, and different parts of your organisation might be at different points. So a trauma affected organisation. So this is where the organisation is unaware or ignorant to the impacts of trauma for their clients and staff. And most of us can probably think of an example where we've worked inside an organisation that's got the potential to re-traumatize or traumatize the people that it works with. Moving on from that, we've got trauma aware. And this is where you're aware of the concept of trauma, you're aware about toxic stress, and you might understand that there are some opportunities for your staff to build resilience, but they're often go over there and do that course, or go and find that resilience somewhere else, rather than embedding it in your organization. And then we've got trauma sensitive. So this is where staff have got foundational knowledge of trauma-informed practice, and they might have some principles around that. They might be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, but they're not really doing too much with that information. It's more about kind of recognizing. And then trauma responsive. So this is where we know what the problem is, we know the situation with trauma, and we're going to integrate that knowledge into our practices, processes, into our policies, into the way we do things, and use that information to prioritize and plan. And then we've got trauma informed. And this is where we want to be kind of heading, trauma informed. So this is where we're actively realizing, recognizing, responding to, and resisting re-traumatization of staff and clients. And then finally, there's healing centered. And we might well have people on the call. In fact, put your hands up if you would class yourself as a healing type of organization. See, I can't see people's faces at the moment, but you may be working in the therapeutic arena, you may be working around, Calder's put her hands up, around some of the kind of more healing focused practices that we have in the voluntary sector. And you can be in both these places at the same time. So it might be that your work with clients is really trauma informed, really healing, really supportive, and how you're working with your staff is maybe just trauma aware. And really, we don't get to that trauma-informed place until it's both internal in our organisations and external. and definitely recognize the kind of factors around that, things like time and capacity. But actually, becoming trauma informed is about prioritizing trauma informed work on both sides. And it might mean holding some boundaries around that as well. So, are you ready for a tool? This is a tool that I use all the time. In fact, I've just used it here at Bolton Lads and Girls Club, which is a systems thinking iceberg. So if everybody's got a pen and a paper, I'd just like them to, I won't ask you to show this later, but scribble down a bit of a picture of an iceberg. And I'm going to go through these different headings and explain a little bit more about what they are. And you can kind of follow along with me and populate the areas of the iceberg that you've written, that you've drawn, with some notes. So an iceberg is a lovely metaphor because it's got this line of visibility. So it's got the little bit that you can see at the top and all the stuff that happens underneath to support the bit at the top. So the bit at the top is called events, but really it's your outputs. It's the things that you do that people can see. So that might be your activities program, your workshops that you run. It might be something that you produce or something you create. So for Action Together, for example, it might be the Wednesdays Weekly program, could be in that events part. So it's things that are external, things that other people can see. And then underneath that, we've got patterns and trends. So these are repeated patterns of behavior. They could be repeated routines. They might be things that you do on a regular basis. And then underneath that, we've got structures and systems. So these are the processes that you use to support the patterns of behavior that you want to create that support the events. So for example, using Action Together again, if our events is Wednesdays Weekly, the patterns and trends are in the title. We hold it every week. Hayley introduces people. The voluntary sector is invited. We've got some patterns there. Structures and systems might include Zoom. It might include the website. It might include how people find the bulletin, how people find out about Wednesdays Weekly. But we've got some structures and systems there that hopefully support the patterns and trends that we want to be creating. And then down at the bottom, we've got mental models. So this is values, beliefs, ethics. So I'd say for Action Together and Wednesdays Weekly, a values or a kind of ethical consideration was we want to create equality of information sharing. So we want to make sure that everybody can access information. And so we use the structure and system of a live and recorded version of Wednesday Weekly. We have a pattern and a trend. Everybody knows it's going to be every week. This is how it's going to run. And then we have our events, which are Wednesdays Weeklies that people actually attend and access and use. But sometimes this can be used as a little bit of a diagnostic tool, because when events happen, if they haven't happened before, all we can do is react to them. And reacting to events takes a lot of energy. It takes personal energy and also energy of your organisation, time, money, resources. So if every week Hayley had forgotten that she was doing Wednesdays Weekly and then suddenly had to run a Wednesdays Weekly and she was only told on Tuesday, and that would be an event that she would have to react to. And you can imagine the kind of energy that would take Hayley to make that happen. And that's where with the voluntary sector, we talk about firefighting a lot. We're reacting to things. We're just constantly reacting because we haven't got time or things pop up. And that's partly to do with wider society and what's happening in the world. And it's partly to do with how we're funded. But it also might be because we haven't taken the time to identify what are the patterns of behavior and action that we want to create. And the really good thing about patterns is that we can anticipate them. So if in Hayley's job description, sorry, Hayley, using you as an example here, it said you need to run the Wednesdays Weeklies, Hayley could anticipate that, create a program of Wednesdays Weeklies put her tasks in her calendar that she needs to do around those Wednesdays weeklies. And then she might choose particular structures and systems that support those patterns to happen. And we need to make sure that Hayley's really on board with this idea of sharing information as well. So you can see how we can start to think in a whole systems approach to how we're working. So if you layer on trauma-informed practice, how are the events that you're running, how can you see them through a trauma-informed lens? What are the patterns and trends that you want to create to make sure that people are safe and supported? What are the structures and systems that you use, and do they support people in a trauma-informed way? So an example of this is if your organizational value is around staff well-being, and the way that you structure your staff's days or organize your team's days is back-to-back meetings, then we've got a mismatch between the value and the process, which means that the patterns and trends won't be as good, and the outcomes, you won't achieve your outcomes, or you'll do it and burn out. So I think this can be a really useful diagnostic tool to think through a trauma-informed lens. And just to simplify, or to give some prompt questions, at the top in that events part, it's about what do we do, what do we create, what do we produce. A prompt question for the patterns and trends is, what's actually been happening? Is it that every week we do this thing and no one comes? Or is it that we always run out of coffee? Or is it that there's some kind of behavior that actually is a bit at odds with what we want to produce or what we want to create? And then thinking about the processes and structures, making sure that those processes and structures actually support the work that we do and we're not just doing them for no reason. And the last question, which I think is the most important, is about what matters to us. We can have some, lofty organizational values around all sorts of things, but if it doesn't matter to us as a staff team, and if it doesn't matter to us as a community or our clients or the people that we work with, then actually we're not going to be able to create the outcomes that we want. So it's a useful tool to start with. So when I say trauma-informed practice is it's a strange word because it means all sorts of things. So as we've been doing our co-design in Bolton, we've been looking at the all of the different things that support trauma-informed practice in the voluntary sector. So there's some lists here of the types of people that need to be involved or are impacted by trauma-informed practice. We've got where and when. So how do we know where trauma-informed practice is needed? How can we create trauma-informed or trauma-supportive spaces, support? Things like thinking about endings and beginnings of projects, of sessions, are really important, particularly in an environment where we've got these short-term contracts and projects start and end. You really want to make sure that the endings and beginnings are done really well so that people aren't left without support after your really good support during the time of the project. Things like signposting, training needs, thinking about your physical environment. So if somebody has come from quite a chaotic childhood environment, they might find quite a chaotic work environment a bit triggering, difficult. And if you know that, then making sure you've got quiet spaces or breakout spaces, or how you organize your day is set out to support people to access what they need in that time, can be really useful. And then there's a whole list here of the how, things that you could consider like group contracts, work around team dynamics, work around peer support. Reflective practice is something that we embed in every project, and we're hoping to run some reflective practice sessions. Well, we are running some reflective practice sessions for the voluntary sector in November. so I can send more details about that if anybody's interested. Some processes around managing conflict, compassion fatigue, difficult conversations, some awareness and understanding of post-traumatic growth, the policies and procedures that support this work, compassion in our leadership and in our interactions, and really cultivating those cultures of support, collaboration and partnerships, team development, influencing change, and emotional literacy. So the toolkit that we're going to produce will have all these resources and more. And it might be that these give you some inspiration to maybe create some more support in your organisation for trauma-informed practice. But that feels like a lot. It feels like an awful lot to understand where we need to work, how we need to work, all these different tools and processes that we might need to embed. So I'd suggest starting with another metaphor. So this is another kind of creative thinking process. Permaculture is a really interesting methodology if you're interested in methodologies, but this sort of simplified version is really useful. So we've got our kind of general foundations of this work. It's about your organizational culture. It's about the knowledge that you have. It's about ethics and principles. And it's basically about getting everybody on the same page around why we want to work in a trauma-informed way. You've then got your design process. And this is about thinking about the ways of working and the tools that you need to design to support your organization to become trauma-informed and to work in a trauma-informed way. And then you've got your specific solutions. So these might be, again, the tools or the templates or the practices or projects that you're going to run to reinforce your trauma-informed practice. And all of these things need to go together. So you might want to map onto some of the stuff that you wrote down for your systems thinking iceberg. You could map that out here and work out, where do you want to put your time and energy first? Is it in those foundations? Is it in designing processes? Or is it that you need some specific solutions, maybe for specific target groups, or maybe for specific situations or circumstances? And then embedding creativity. So I've got some images here of some work that we've done with different organizations around creating trauma-informed practice. And I'm just going to talk you through these different ideas just to spark a little bit of creativity in you. So first of all, we've got Mavis there on the orange background. And it was actually a workshop that I did for Rochdale Council. And we did some work around kind of person-centered work, and the groups had to come up with a character to work with that represented their client group in some way. And they created Mavis, and they gave her a nickname of Maeve the Rave. And Maeve was she had a colourful life, and she was now an older person who feels like she's kind of lost touch with her community. And so we were designing solutions in the practice and process that we worked to ensure that Mavis was supported through her older ages. So we use collage here, and collage can be brilliant for kind of humanizing pieces of work that we do around clients. It's really good for non-verbal work. So if we are working with maybe with children or people with English as a second or third language, we might want to use collages to work through different ideas so people can express themselves in a different way by using images that they've just taken out of a magazine. And the two photos at the bottom of that block as well are some more collage work. And this was a arts charity who'd done a performance about mothers in crisis. So it was about the experience of motherhood during the pandemic, and they created a piece of performance and singing. And then this workshop was about evaluating their experience of being part of this group of mothers of all different ages and backgrounds coming together in real solidarity. And they've created these collages which have been turned into flags for an exhibition. And again, a really lovely way to use words and images to connect to emotions and express ourselves. So it might be that you've got a project evaluation coming up and you might consider using collage to explore that. There's a picture at the top as well of, so this was a superhero. Somebody drew the superhero for us, and it was a very traditional kind of male Superman, which the group turned into a trans male Superman, because they recognized that taking those kind of traditional assumptions around who's the super person might be problematic. And the group mapped all of the kind of superhero qualities of compassionate leaders, and then all the barriers to compassionate leadership as well. And this can be a really useful activity if you're working on board development, or if you're supporting maybe a new management team, to think about what are the qualities that we need to and skills that we need to have and embed in our work, but also what are the barriers to those, to showing those qualities or using those skills. And that can start some development conversations. Looking at the bottom, these are more sort of physical type activities. So the first one with two people touching their fingers. This was a workshop around trust building. And during the workshop, first of all, this was our colleague Dave who ran this workshop. And he asked people to stand up, find somebody they don't know, and just touch their fingers together and then sit back down again. And then we did a little bit more work. And then everybody had to get up, find that person and touch fingers, and then start moving one hand and then the other hand. And then they sat down and did some more work. And then they started moving their whole body. And then they started kind of doing this dance in response to each other. And it was just a really beautiful, gentle way of building up trust and connection between two people in quite an intimate way that felt kind of non-threatening, because it was so gentle and gradual, and people were able to find connection with each other in between times. So a lovely way to develop group connection and group support. Then we've got a line of people doing one of my favorite activities, which is called a dyad, where it's about having paired conversations and an active listener and an active speaker for a set period of time around the same subject. So the subject could be a topic like connection, or it could be a project theme. And each person, oh, Bernie, you've started sharing your screen, I think. There we go. I will.
Sorry, Kerry, I've just got rid of that.
That's all right. Yes, so you'll have your topic, and then you're allowed 3 minutes, say, to really talk about that topic without being prompted or questioned by the other person. And then you repeat the process with the new partner. And it's amazing how, even if we're in organizations that work with each other all the time, we don't give space to that compassionate, active listening. And I think that's something that we could all do more of within our organizations, because we're so quick to try and want to say the next thing or explain why we've tried that already. So yeah, that's a really useful tool where you can be quite creative, but you don't need any materials. The one at the bottom is, again, that Mothers in Crisis project, and there is a mother and a baby. And this one was at the performance, and we asked people some specific questions about how watching the performance had supported their own well-being. And they were asked to add a pipe cleaner if they thought a certain thing. And through the evening, we built up this pipe cleaner sculpture, which represented how valuable people had found the session. So sometimes it's about finding those little creative things that people can engage with and the public can engage with. And then last of all, we've got our washing line of people. And on one side of the people, there's a smiley face, and on the other side, there's a sad face. Whilst that's a little bit rudimentary, we were asking people in that workshop to think about what helped and what didn't help around a particular situation. and just capturing and then being able to create this washing line that people could sort of walk along and absorb as they were having their lunch, really kind of framed what we were talking about in the day. So it's another little creative way of bringing something in, even if you don't feel like you're a creative person. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask for any thoughts